The streets of Brooklyn in the 1940s were filled with ambition, grit, and danger. Among the crowded tenements and bustling neighborhoods, a young boy watched the world of men with fascination. Men who commanded respect, power, and fear. That boy was Henry Hill. From an early age, he was drawn to the thrill of the Mafia lifestyle. Fast cars, flashy clothes, and a sense of invincibility. To the outside world, it looked glamorous. But beneath the glimmer of wealth and influence lay a world of violence, betrayal, and consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. This is the story of a man who rose from a street-smart kid to one of the most infamous figures in organized crime, whose choices would ultimately lead him to fame, infamy, and a life he could never escape. Brooklyn, New York in the 1940s was a city of hard edges and bright lights, a place where the hum of the elevated trains mingled with the scent of fresh bread from corner bakeries. It was a city where opportunity and danger walked hand in hand, where ambition could be rewarded with money and respect, or punished with violence and fear. In one of its crowded neighborhoods, among brick tenements and narrow streets, Henry Hill was born on June 11, 1943, to a modest Italian-American family. His father, a hard-working man with little patience for nonsense, tried to instill in his son the value of an honest life, while his mother, warm but wary, hoped her son would avoid the temptations that lured so many young men into the shadows. But Brooklyn had a way of shaping its children, and Henry's eyes were already drawn to a world far more alluring than the confines of his family apartment. So, from a young age, Henry was mesmerized by the figures who strode confidently through his neighborhood. Men in suits, polished shoes and fedoras, men who seemed to carry the power of the world in their posture and words. To Henry, these were not criminals in the sense his parents described. These were kings of their domain, people who commanded respect, and he wanted in. By the time he was 10, he had learned the art of observation, watching the comings and goings of local stores, the interactions between men on street corners, and the subtle signs that distinguished a man with influence from one without. He saw how respect could be bought, earned, or violently taken, and he understood, even as a boy, that power was something he craved. School, in Henry's life, was more of a backdrop than a focus. He attended the local public schools, but his attention was rarely on the lessons inside the classroom. Instead, he roamed the streets, learning from experience rather than textbooks. By his early teens, he had developed a keen sense for spotting weakness, reading people, and recognizing opportunity. Small thefts began almost naturally. Stealing candy, picking pockets, sneaking coins from purses left unattended. These minor infractions were his first lessons in risk and reward. Unlike other boys who feared punishment, Henry reveled in the thrill. It was not just about the act itself, but about the skill required, the gamble, and the feeling of stepping into a world that seemed reserved for adults. By the time Henry was 13, he had begun to make connections with local criminals. Brooklyn was a neighborhood where the Mafia's influence ran quietly but powerfully. Men like Paul Vario, a man who would later become one of Henry's closest mentors, moved through the streets with a mixture of charm and menace. To Henry, they were both fascinating and aspirational. Vario, along with other established mob figures, took notice of the street-smart boy who had eyes like a hawk and nerves like steel. They saw in him potential, a willingness to learn, to serve, and perhaps one day to rise. Henry, eager to belong, soaked up their lessons. How to talk to people, how to intimidate without raising suspicion, how to make money fast and quietly, and most importantly, how to navigate a world where loyalty and betrayal were two sides of the same coin. As he grew older, Henry's petty crimes evolved into more serious ventures. By his mid-teens, he was involved in shoplifting rings and small-time hustles, but these were merely stepping stones. He quickly realized that the streets offered more lucrative opportunities for those willing to take risks. He began working for local loan sharks and bookmakers, learning the delicate balance between charm and threat, persuasion and coercion. He observed how money moved through the neighborhood, how debts were collected, and how the unwritten rules of the street governed behavior. Every action carried weight, and mistakes could be fatal. But Henry was cautious yet daring, understanding that survival required both brains and bravado. The lure of fast money and recognition soon led him into the orbit of the Lucchese crime family, one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. It was an environment that demanded respect, efficiency, and absolute discretion. Henry proved himself quickly, not through formal initiation but by his ability to execute assignments, handle logistics, and move through the city without drawing unnecessary attention. He learned the intricacies of organized crime, how to conduct burglaries that left no trace, how to transport stolen goods discreetly, and how to blend seamlessly into everyday life while operating in the shadows. He also witnessed firsthand the darker aspects: violence as a tool of enforcement, intimidation as a method of control, and betrayal as an ever-present threat. Henry's relationships with key figures in the family solidified his standing. Men like Jimmy Burke, whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him, became both mentors and cautionary examples. From Burke, Henry learned that loyalty was everything, but survival sometimes meant bending that loyalty in subtle ways. From Paul Vario, he absorbed lessons in strategy, patience, and the art of negotiation. These men taught him that the world of organized crime was not glamorous. It required discipline, cunning, and a constant awareness that one misstep could be fatal. Yet, to Henry, this world offered a freedom and status that the conventional life of school, work, and modest ambition could never provide. By the late 1950s, Henry was fully immersed in the life he had long admired. He drove the flashy cars, wore the sharp suits, and mingled with people who wielded real power. But he also experienced the cost of such a life: paranoia, constant vigilance, and the moral compromises that weighed on him, even if he tried not to admit it. The thrill of criminal exploits came with a shadow, a realization that the streets that raised him were also capable of destroying him. Yet, Henry pressed forward, motivated by ambition, fascination, and the intoxicating allure of the Mafia lifestyle. Even in his formative years, Henry displayed a remarkable ability to balance risk and opportunity. He was not reckless. He calculated each move, understanding that the game required both audacity and precision. This combination of intelligence, daring, and streetwise savvy earned him respect among his peers and elders alike. His story, even at this early stage, was one of a boy transformed into a man by circumstance, choice, and environment. A man who would soon rise to notoriety, whose actions would leave indelible marks on the criminal landscape of America, and whose life would serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination for generations to come. As Chapter 1 closes, we see Henry Hill at the precipice of adulthood, fully engaged in the criminal world he once only admired from a distance. The streets of Brooklyn have shaped him, taught him, and tested him. And yet, despite the dangers that surround him, Henry continues to rise, drawn ever deeper into a life that promises wealth, power, and notoriety, but which also carries the seeds of his eventual downfall. The foundation has been laid for a life that will be remembered, not for its virtues, but for its audacity, its peril, and the extraordinary journey of a man who became both a part of history and a symbol of the perilous allure of organized crime. Brooklyn in the 1960s was alive with a rhythm of ambition, money, and danger. The streets Henry Hill had once wandered as a boy now felt different. He walked them with confidence, with purpose, with the authority of someone who belonged. By the time he was in his late teens, Henry was no longer a curious observer of the Mafia lifestyle. He was an active participant, an emerging figure in the shadows, learning not just how to survive in this world, but how to thrive. Every move he made was deliberate, every decision calculated. The thrill of the streets, the intoxicating power of money, and the magnetic pull of respect and fear drove him forward. Henry's relationship with the Lucchese family had grown stronger. He was no longer just a small-time associate. He was trusted with operations that demanded discretion and skill. Under the guidance of Paul Vario, his mentor, and Jimmy Burke, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, Henry began to navigate the complex hierarchy of organized crime. He learned quickly that the Mafia was a delicate balance of loyalty, influence, and intimidation. A single misstep could cost a man his freedom or his life. But Henry thrived in this environment. He understood the rules, and he knew when to bend them. His work for the family spanned a wide range of criminal activities. He became involved in loan sharking, collecting debts from those who had borrowed money at exorbitant interest rates. There was an art to it, a combination of persuasion, charm, and subtle threat. Henry learned how to read people, how to detect fear or bravado, and how to push boundaries without crossing into deadly territory. Each encounter, each collection, was a lesson in psychology and strategy. It was not enough to be tough. A successful enforcer needed intelligence, patience, and a sense of timing. Henry quickly mastered this delicate balance. In addition to loan sharking, Henry participated in extortion and theft, often working in teams with other associates. One of his earliest notable ventures involved hijacking trucks carrying goods across the city. These operations required careful planning, coordination, and execution. Henry learned the mechanics of the heist, how to select targets, how to avoid detection, and how to distribute the spoils without attracting attention from law enforcement or rival gangs. He began to understand the intricate web of criminal enterprise, where every role had a purpose, and every mistake could ripple through the organization with devastating consequences. Through his work, Henry forged deep bonds with other members of the family. Jimmy Burke, in particular, became a figure of immense influence in his life. Burke was a man who commanded respect through fear and loyalty, a man whose charisma masked a brutal pragmatism. Under Burke's mentorship, Henry witnessed firsthand the harsh realities of organized crime. He saw friends and associates vanish, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, as the rules of the underworld were enforced without hesitation. Yet, amidst the danger, Henry found camaraderie, and a sense of belonging that he had never experienced in the conventional world. These relationships were as valuable as the money he earned. They provided protection, guidance, and a sense of identity in a world where betrayal was always a possibility. Henry's personal life became intertwined with his criminal endeavors. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and attended parties where money flowed freely and respect was currency. To the outside observer, he seemed to have achieved the dream life, a life of glamour and influence. But beneath the surface, the reality was far more complex. The constant threat of law enforcement, rival families, and internal betrayal weighed heavily on him. Every decision carried risk, and the stakes were never just financial. They were often matters of life and death. Henry's world was a high-wire act, and he had learned to walk it with precision. By the late 1960s, Henry had become a key player in the family's operations. His reputation for reliability, intelligence, and discretion spread beyond Brooklyn. He was trusted with increasingly significant heists, including sophisticated schemes to hijack trucks and steal goods from under the noses of law enforcement. These operations required not only planning, but also innovation. Henry and his associates developed methods to track shipments, coordinate with insiders, and execute thefts with minimal exposure. Success in these ventures brought money, respect, and increased responsibility. It also drew attention from both the police and rival criminals. One of the most pivotal aspects of Henry's rise was his involvement in the infamous Lufthansa heist of 1978. Though this event would later become a defining moment in his life, the groundwork for such operations was laid during these formative years. Henry's ability to plan, organize, and execute complex criminal endeavors made him indispensable. He understood the value of intelligence, surveillance, and timing. The heist itself would be audacious and unprecedented, but Henry's skills had been honed over a decade of smaller, yet increasingly sophisticated crimes. Each success reinforced his confidence. Each failure taught him caution. By now, he was not just a participant in the Mafia. He was a strategist, a man whose decisions could shape the fortunes of the entire family. Amidst the rising power and wealth, Henry also developed a keen sense of the internal politics of organized crime. The Mafia was not just about action on the streets. It was a hierarchy governed by codes, rules, and unspoken expectations. Loyalty was paramount, but so was the ability to navigate conflicts without drawing unnecessary attention. Henry learned to balance ambition with prudence, to pursue opportunities while maintaining the favor of his superiors. This political acumen, combined with his operational expertise, positioned him as a rising star within the family. Henry's lifestyle during this period was a blend of excess and vigilance. He attended lavish parties, spent freely, and enjoyed the privileges of his position. But he also maintained a constant awareness of the dangers around him. The streets of Brooklyn were unforgiving, and the law enforcement agencies were persistent. Henry had to cultivate networks of informants, stay alert to surveillance, and anticipate moves by both rivals and the authorities. This dual existence, luxury on one side, peril on the other, was a defining feature of his life. It shaped his personality, sharpened his instincts, and reinforced the lessons he had learned in his early years. Despite the apparent glamour, Henry was never blind to the moral complexities of his world. He witnessed violence, betrayal, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Friends and associates who had risen alongside him were often destroyed by their own choices or by the unforgiving rules of the Mafia. Henry's understanding of these dynamics deepened over time. He learned that success in this world required more than skill. It required judgment, loyalty, and sometimes a willingness to make harsh decisions. The lessons were costly, but they were necessary for survival. By the mid-1970s, Henry's influence and involvement in the Mafia had reached its peak. He had become an integral part of operations that spanned the city and beyond. The combination of intelligence, audacity, and loyalty had earned him both respect and notoriety. He was no longer a young street-smart kid. He was a seasoned operator, fully immersed in the life he had once admired from a distance. His name carried weight, his decisions mattered, and his actions had consequences that extended far beyond Brooklyn. Yet, even at this height, cracks were beginning to form. The life of crime, with all its rewards, also carried mounting pressures. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified, internal tensions grew, and the consequences of past actions began to catch up. Henry's rise, remarkable in its speed and success, was accompanied by a growing awareness that the world he had mastered was also one in which stability was fragile, loyalty was conditional, and danger was ever present. Chapter 2 closes with Henry Hill standing at the pinnacle of his early career, a man who had achieved status, power, and wealth in the Mafia world, yet who was beginning to sense that the forces he had embraced with ambition could also turn against him. The streets that had nurtured his rise were the same streets that could precipitate his fall. And while he basked in the glow of success, the seeds of betrayal, law enforcement pursuit, and personal downfall were quietly taking root, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would define the next chapter of his extraordinary life. The streets of Brooklyn that had once nurtured Henry Hill's rise now felt different. The glow of wealth and influence had dimmed, replaced by shadows of suspicion, paranoia, and the relentless pursuit of law enforcement. By the mid-1970s, the world Henry had mastered was beginning to close in on him. The audacity of his heists, the scope of his operations, and the notoriety of the associates around him had drawn attention not just from rival criminals, but from a legal system increasingly determined to bring the Mafia to justice. Every success that had once elevated him now carried a weight of risk heavier than the gold and cash he had accumulated. The life he had chosen, the life he had embraced with ambition and courage, was beginning to unravel. The turning point for Henry was both sudden and inevitable. The FBI and local law enforcement had begun tightening the net around organized crime families in New York. Surveillance, informants, and undercover operations became part of his daily reality. Every phone call, every meeting, every transaction could be observed, recorded, or analyzed. The streets that had once seemed a playground of opportunity now felt like a gauntlet. Henry knew that mistakes could be fatal, not just for him, but for those he cared about. The fear that had always lurked at the edges of his consciousness now became a constant companion. Henry's closest associates were no longer just mentors or friends. They were potential threats. Jimmy Burke, whose ruthlessness had once inspired awe, now exemplified the darker side of loyalty and fear. The same men who had taught Henry the ways of power were now the ones whose wrath could descend upon him in an instant. Murders, Disappearances and betrayals were no longer abstract lessons. They were real and immediate. Henry's world had always been precarious, but now the fragility was undeniable. The Mafia's code of silence, the omerta that had governed behavior for decades, began to clash with the pressures of law enforcement and the shifting dynamics of criminal enterprise. It was within this climate of fear and scrutiny that Henry faced his first real moral and practical dilemma, the question of loyalty versus survival. By this time, he had been implicated in a series of high-profile criminal activities, including hijackings, loan sharking, and extortion. The Lufthansa heist loomed as the crown jewel of these operations, a theft of millions from JFK Airport, executed with audacity and precision. But the aftermath of the heist would be as dangerous as the act itself. The law was closing in, and internal suspicion within the family was mounting. Henry had seen associates vanish, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, as fear and paranoia spread. He understood that in the Mafia, failure to protect oneself could be fatal. The decision that would define the next chapter of Henry's life came as both a shock and a relief. Facing potential arrest and the possibility of a life sentence, he chose to cooperate with law enforcement. He became an informant for the FBI, agreeing to testify against his former associates in exchange for protection. This decision was not made lightly. It represented a fundamental betrayal of the Mafia's most sacred code, a rupture in the world he had devoted his life to mastering. Yet it was also a pragmatic choice, a way to survive in a world where the stakes had become unacceptably high. By turning informant, Henry accepted both the immediate dangers of retaliation and the long-term consequences of living under constant threat. Henry's cooperation with law enforcement set in motion a series of events that would shake the Mafia to its core. The testimony he provided implicated key figures in the Lucchese family, exposing the inner workings of the organization to prosecutors and investigators. Men who had once seemed invincible were suddenly vulnerable. Long-standing operations were disrupted, and decades of secrecy began to unravel. Henry's knowledge, accumulated over years of meticulous observation and participation, proved invaluable. He provided details not just of crimes, but of the structure, hierarchy, and strategies of the organization. The Mafia, which had once been a world of absolute control and certainty, now faced exposure from within. The consequences of Henry's betrayal were immediate and severe. Friends and former mentors reacted with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and vengeance. The world he had inhabited, where loyalty had been the highest virtue, now became a landscape of threats and fear. Henry was forced to enter the Witness Protection Program, adopting a new identity and severing ties with nearly everyone he had known. The transition was difficult and isolating. The camaraderie, the adrenaline, the sense of belonging that had defined his adult life were gone. In their place were anonymity, vigilance, and the constant awareness that the past could reach him at any moment. Life under protection was a stark contrast to the luxury and influence Henry had once enjoyed. The flashy suits, the expensive cars, and the power over others were replaced by modest apartments, routine, and a careful balance between concealment and survival. Henry had to relearn how to live in a world where his name carried no weight, where he could no longer command respect with posture or threat. It was a humbling experience, one that tested his resilience and adaptability. Yet, it was also a chance at survival, an opportunity to live beyond the reach of the violence and betrayal that had once defined his life. Even as he adapted to his new circumstances, Henry remained haunted by the life he had left behind. The men he had betrayed, the crimes he had committed, and the relationships he had severed continued to occupy his thoughts. There was a constant tension between relief at surviving and guilt over the destruction his cooperation had caused. The luxury and thrill of his past were gone, but the memories remained vivid. Each recollection carried both nostalgia and regret, a reminder that even the most calculated decisions could not erase the impact of a life lived on the edge of morality and law. Henry's story during this period was also marked by personal struggle. Adjusting to anonymity, managing fear, and confronting the consequences of betrayal required emotional fortitude. Relationships once taken for granted became complicated. Family members and loved ones had to be protected, their safety constantly considered. The balance between secrecy and normalcy was delicate, and mistakes could be catastrophic. Henry had to navigate this new life with the same precision and awareness that had once guided his criminal operations. Only now, the threats were more insidious, and the stakes remained existential. Despite these challenges, Henry's experience as an informant brought broader consequences beyond his personal survival. Law enforcement used his testimony to secure convictions, dismantle operations, and gain unprecedented insight into the Mafia's inner workings. The ripple effects were profound, reshaping organized crime in New York and influencing law enforcement strategies nationwide. Henry's actions demonstrated the power of insider knowledge, the vulnerability of even the most secretive organizations, and the complex interplay between loyalty, survival, and morality. His cooperation highlighted the fragile balance of trust that underpinned criminal enterprises and exposed the human vulnerabilities behind the myth of invincibility. The period of betrayal and downfall also underscored the duality of Henry's character. He was both a mastermind of crime and a man seeking redemption through survival. He had achieved extraordinary feats within the Mafia, yet he recognized the cost of ambition and loyalty misplaced. His decisions reflected a combination of pragmatism, self-preservation, and reflection. The streets that had once shaped him now demanded his surrender, not to law enforcement alone, but to the realization that his life had been irreversibly altered. The lessons of the underworld, once instruments of empowerment, became tools of caution and survival. As Chapter 3 closes, Henry Hill stands as a transformed figure. A man who has experienced the heights of power, the depths of fear, and the consequences of betrayal. The life that had once seemed glamorous and unstoppable is now defined by vigilance, anonymity, and the delicate balance of survival. The streets that nurtured his rise have given way to the uncertain landscape of witness protection, and the relationships that once offered guidance and camaraderie are forever changed. Yet, in this transformed life, there remains a resilience, a capacity to adapt, and an awareness of the extraordinary journey he has traversed. A journey that blends audacity, danger, and the complex interplay of loyalty and survival in the world of organized crime. The world Henry Hill entered after leaving the Mafia was one of stark contrasts. Gone were the days of flashy cars, tailored suits, and easy money. In their place were modest apartments, government oversight, and a life lived in the shadows. Witness protection offered him safety, but it demanded a new kind of vigilance. Every day was measured, every interaction calculated, and every decision weighed against the ever-present threat of retribution. It was a world far removed from the adrenaline and audacity of his criminal years, yet it was a world in which survival was paramount. At first, the adjustment was brutal. The skills that had once made Henry indispensable in the underworld, intimidation, strategic planning, quick thinking, now felt almost irrelevant. In place of power, he was given anonymity. In place of wealth, modest stipends. And in place of camaraderie, isolation. Family and friends were separated or moved for their own safety, leaving Henry with a sense of displacement. He quickly realized that the life he had mastered came with no blueprint for normalcy. Each day required careful navigation between invisibility and existence, between safety and suffocation. Chain. Despite these challenges, Henry attempted to carve out a semblance of normal life. He found employment, tried to maintain relationships, and sought moments of ordinary joy. Yet the past was never far behind. Law enforcement and the media were aware of his story, and the notoriety he had accumulated in the Mafia followed him. Every new identity, every move to a different town, was a reminder that the consequences of his former life could reach him even in the most carefully protected circumstances. It was a constant balancing act, attempting to live without attracting attention, while acknowledging that the life he left behind had left an indelible mark on who he was. The psychological toll was immense. Henry had spent decades operating in a world where decisions were immediate, consequences were tangible, and power was a tangible commodity. Now, in witness protection, he faced a different kind of pressure. The weight of survival without the adrenaline of crime. The monotony of ordinary life juxtaposed against memories of high-stakes heists, and the knowledge that betrayal, once a tool of self-preservation, had become a defining characteristic of his existence. Sleep was sometimes elusive, paranoia occasionally overwhelming, and the question of identity remained unresolved. Who was Henry Hill without the Mafia? And could a man built on audacity and cunning truly adapt to anonymity? Over time, Henry began to find ways to reconcile his past with his present. He embraced the opportunities available to him, using his notoriety in controlled ways to generate income and purpose. He gave interviews, participated in documentaries, and eventually became a consultant for films about organized crime. His first-hand knowledge of the Mafia's inner workings offered a unique perspective that fascinated the public. It was during this period that his life story became widely known through the book Wise Guy, written by Nicholas Pileggi, and later immortalized in Martin Scorsese's film Goodfellas. The cinematic portrayal of his life brought both fame and scrutiny, transforming him into a symbol of the allure and peril of organized crime. The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed Henry to monetize his experiences, build a post-criminal career, and retain some level of relevance. On the other hand, it forced him to confront the very public nature of his transgressions, the lives affected by his choices, and the ongoing risk of retribution from those still loyal to the old codes of the Mafia. His notoriety became a permanent aspect of his existence, a reminder that while the streets could no longer claim him physically, they continued to inhabit his identity, shaping perceptions and influencing opportunities. Henry's personal life during these years was marked by both resilience and difficulty. Relationships were complicated by his past, and trust remained fragile. The very qualities that had made him successful in the criminal world, caution, strategic thinking, and adaptability, were now essential for maintaining connections, protecting family, and navigating a society that often viewed him with suspicion or fascination. He attempted to cultivate stability, but the psychological echoes of a life once filled with danger and excitement were never far away. The struggle to reconcile the past with the present defined much of his adult life after leaving organized crime. Despite the challenges, Henry demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. He learned to operate in a world that demanded subtlety rather than aggression, discretion rather than audacity. He leveraged his experiences into opportunities for speaking engagements, writing, and consultancy. These endeavors allowed him to remain connected to the narrative of his own life while maintaining the physical safety afforded by his witness protection status. Through storytelling, he was able to contextualize his past, offering lessons and reflections on choices, consequences, and the complexities of loyalty and ambition. His life became both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination for audiences worldwide. Henry's legacy, as it unfolded, was multifaceted. He was simultaneously a symbol of the glamour and danger of organized crime, a cautionary example of the costs of ambition and betrayal, and a testament to human adaptability and survival. Through his willingness to speak openly about his experiences, he provided insight into a world often shrouded in secrecy. Historians, filmmakers, and the public found in him a lens through which to understand not only the mechanics of the Mafia, but the human dimensions of fear, loyalty, and morality. His life story blurred the line between legend and reality, illustrating how personal choices interact with broader social and criminal systems. Yet, even as he found fame and purpose in recounting his past, Henry was constantly reminded of the fragility of life outside the Mafia. The threats that had once loomed in the alleys of Brooklyn persisted in subtler forms. Former associates, unresolved vendettas, and the unpredictable nature of public attention required him to remain vigilant. Safety, while improved through relocation and anonymity, was never absolute. The lessons of the streets remained relevant. Awareness, discretion, and adaptability were as crucial in ordinary life as they had been during the height of his criminal career. Henry's later years also involved reflection and reconciliation with himself. He grappled with guilt, pride, and the consequences of his choices. The life he had led, filled with crime, excitement, and betrayal, contrasted sharply with the relatively mundane existence he now inhabited. He acknowledged the allure of the Mafia, the intoxicating power of wealth and influence, and the thrill of audacious schemes. Simultaneously, he confronted the cost of these pursuits: the fear, the loss of friends, the alienation from family, and the permanent stain on his reputation. This duality defined him, a man both shaped and haunted by the extraordinary life he had lived. As public interest in his story grew, Henry became a figure whose experiences could be examined for both entertainment and instruction. His interviews offered candid insight into the operational details of organized crime, the psychology of criminals, and the ethical dilemmas inherent in loyalty and survival. Audiences were fascinated not merely by the acts themselves, but by the human dimensions: the decisions, the fears, and the moral compromises that characterized life in the Mafia. Henry's reflections illuminated the complexities of criminal enterprise, demonstrating that beneath the mythology of power and fear lay very human struggles with ambition, identity, and consequence. Even as he aged, Henry maintained a presence in the public eye, carefully navigating the tension between exposure and security. He offered a narrative that was at once cautionary and compelling, emphasizing the lessons learned while acknowledging the allure that had drawn him in. His life after the Mafia became a study in adaptation, resilience, and the long shadow of past choices. The streets that had shaped him, the crimes that had elevated him, and the betrayals that had saved him all coalesced into a narrative that was uniquely his own, a testament to the complexities of human behavior under extraordinary circumstances. Henry's story ultimately underscores the fragility of power, the cost of ambition, and the enduring impact of choices. He survived where others perished, adapted where others faltered, and transformed his notoriety into both livelihood and legacy. His life after the Mafia was not glamorous, but it was enduring, a testament to his intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. Through his experiences, he provided insight into a world that few could access, and offered lessons that extended beyond crime into the human condition itself. Chapter 4 closes with Henry Hill reflecting on a life extraordinary in its highs and lows. He had walked the tightrope of power and peril, navigated loyalty and betrayal, and emerged into a world markedly different from the one he had once dominated. His legacy, immortalized through literature, film, and personal testimony, continues to fascinate and educate. The story of Henry Hill is one of audacity, consequence, and survival, a life that bridged the gap between myth and reality, danger and reflection, crime and adaptation. In the end, he remained a figure both celebrated and cautionary, a man whose journey through the underworld left a mark that history and popular culture would not soon forget. Henry Hill's life was a journey through extremes, a boy fascinated by the streets of Brooklyn, a man who rose to the heights of the Mafia, and finally a survivor navigating a world far removed from the one he had once ruled. His story is one of ambition and audacity, loyalty and betrayal, risk and consequence. He lived a life most could only imagine, but he paid a price that few could endure. From the adrenaline of high-stakes crime to the isolation of witness protection, from the glamour of wealth to the shadows of fear, Henry's life reflects both the allure and the peril of choices made in the pursuit of power. In the end, his legacy is immortal, not just in books and films, but as a cautionary tale and a testament to human adaptability. Henry Hill's story reminds us that every action has consequences, every choice carries weight, and even in the darkest worlds, survival requires courage, cunning, and resilience. The streets of Brooklyn that once shaped him remain etched in memory, but the man he became, complex, flawed, and unforgettable, continues to fascinate, offering lessons that echo far beyond the world of crime.